One of the best ways to honor veterans is through the proper rendering of taps. In this video, I'll provide some context, performance tips, and show you the most famous performance of taps of all time. Also, be sure to stick around to the end for my interpretation and performance of taps. To the veterans who have served in our nation's military, happy Veterans Day and thank you for your service. So during the 2000s, I had the honor of performing taps at Arlington National Cemetery over 500 times as a member of the United States Air Force Band in Washington, D.C. First called Lights Out to signal the end of the day, it later transformed into the call that we all know. In 1862, Union General Daniel Butterfield and his brigade bugler, Oliver Wilcox Norton, revised an earlier bugle call to form the 24 hauntingly beautiful notes that we know today as taps. The call quickly spread throughout the Union and Confederate armies to signal the end of the day. Later that same year, in 1862, at a battlefield funeral, Captain John Tidball chose to forego the firing of the customary volleys over the grave for fear that it might tip off the enemy, and chose instead for the bugler to perform taps as a substitute. It obviously stuck, and for over 160 years, taps has been heard throughout our nation at military funerals to honor those who have served. Perhaps the most famous taps of all time was performed by Army trumpeter Keith Clark at President John F. Kennedy's funeral. On a chilly late November day, Keith Clark stood for several hours awaiting the funeral procession. When it was finally the part of the service that Clark performed taps, he chipped the sixth note, something very easy to do, especially in that weather climate and in those circumstances. To many, the small mistake was a poignant symbol of the American nation in mourning. That small mistake made this rendition all the more powerful. Click at the top of the screen for a video of Keith Clark's performance of taps at John F. Kennedy's funeral. And now for some performance tips. Whether you're a part-time trumpet player performing taps from your front porch on Memorial Day, or you're taking a military audition, I hope you find these tips helpful. With regard to taps at auditions for military jobs, you should take this one very seriously. You can tell so much about intonation, sound, and musicality. If these areas lack in your sounding of taps, it can be an automatic disqualifier. In my time in the military, no one trumpet player sounded taps the exact same way. There's room to add a personal touch. But a great taps has these qualities: a beautiful sound, a musical arch, and a touch of natural vibrato as if you're singing it. Earlier I mentioned how there's some freedom allowed, but it's important that there's a rhythmic underlying. I like to think of the rhythm in terms of eighth note subdivisions. For example, the opening pickups are like a dotted quarter note, eighth note, and then the fermata note. Same thing with the second statement. A consistent rhythm throughout helps organize the call for an even more stirring rendition. As far as where to breathe, that's open to interpretation as well. I can speak to where I breathe, but the biggest thing, in my opinion, is to not have gaping holes where the breath takes place. You want to keep the musical line going throughout, and you don't want the breath to get in the way of the overall musical arch. I breathe after all of the fermatas, including the first one. Many players won't breathe until the second fermata. Both are acceptable. I also like to sometimes grab a quick breath before the pickups to the third fermata to keep my air supply up for the long fermata note. Then the last two breaths are pretty obvious, after the fermata and then before the last three notes. It's important to note that the Marines play a different rhythm in the middle section. They play a dotted rhythm, whereas the other services play straight eighth notes. The very last note is an important one. I start with a straight tone, add a little vibrato, and try to fade away to nothing. And now, here's my interpretation of taps. If you find value here, click like and consider subscribing to this channel. See you in the next video.